Hello, everyone. I'll be going over the solutions for how to understand the test history file. Specifically, I'll be going over the test store short, test store dupe, and test store reset. So to start this demonstration, here we have, just a blank VS Code. Uh, we'll we'll want to start by actually going to the test history file. So to do this, we'll open the idle test folder. We'll scroll down to test history, which will be here. And here you could see, this is where I think the outline view can be helpful. You can see all the different tests. You could see we start with line 1 and line 2 up here. So this, I'm assuming, will be useful for actually running certain tests. I imagine we'll be using line 1 and line 2. And here we have store test, test wrapper, fetch test, something like this, right? It looks like here is what we want to be looking at: test store short, dupe, and reset. So start with just like looking at the test case in general. Typically looking at the setup class and teardown class can give us a bit of a clue as to what's going on in these series of tests. So it looks like it says we are testing history with mock text. And if you don't know about this, you can maybe explore it a little bit more, look into this mock text. From my exploration of this, it seems like it's sort of, and I think it even mentions here, a mock version of the tkinter text widget. And then it looks like we're actually initializing a history object using the mock text object. So then we have tear down, where it looks like we are just deleting all of the text that exists in the widget. And we are setting this history field to just be an empty list. Okay, at the present, I'm not fully sure what that means. Let's skip over test init for now and just get into the actual test cases here. So here for test store short, so just by reading the test case names, this can start to give us some hint. I'm assuming this has to do with short versus long, maybe commands, short versus long time frame. For just this word short, we have already some sort of hypotheses about what we're testing here. But then it looks like something that we're doing is testing a short input. So we're storing just the command A for the Python shell, and then we want to check if history is still empty. Okay, so interesting. We see that even after we sort of like type in a specific command, we shouldn't be saving it. And then again, we store the same command, but it looks like there's a couple of spaces before and after. So we did make it a bit longer, even though it was just white space at the beginning and end. And again, we still don't want anything to be stored into like the set of history, the historical sort of like commands that we've given. So what I'm sort of gleaning from this test case is that we want to be handling short inputs in such a way that we do not store them. To me, that's what this means. And we can see that in the specific case with just a one letter input, but the general case would be short inputs do not get stored in the shell history. Next, let's move to test store dup or dupe or duplicate, which is what I think this is meaning here. Again, we could start to have some hypotheses of this has to do with how we should handle duplicate inputs. So first, we are storing line 1. And we know from earlier, I just clicked on line 1 and outline here, that line 1 is just a equals 7. So this is actually longer than the command in the previous test case, because now we have, 3 actual characters, but there's a space in between. So we have a 5-character command here. And going back down to test store duplicate, we store in line 1, and then now we want history. So all of the past inputs, we want it to just include line 1. Okay, so perfect. This sort of confirms our understanding of the previous one too, that based on the length of the input, we want to store that input in history. And then when we store line 2, now we want history to have added line 2 to our history of inputs. So again, this makes sense. But then it looks like we are storing line 1 again. So then we re-enter this a equals 7 command. And now it looks like the way that we should handle that duplicate input from A, B, A, we want to just sort of remove that initial input and move it to its most recent position. So now, since we ran line 1 again, we want line 1 to be the last or most recent input, and we remove the earlier one. So for this specific case, I just sort of walked through it, but in a general sense, to me, what this means is that when we have a duplicate input, we want to remove it from where it historically has been and place it where it rightfully should be, which is the most recent input. And finally, this test store reset. So this, I think, is one of the more complicated tests. And I actually think this gives us a good like sort of example of how we should, in addition to looking at test cases, also refer to comments and the source code, okay? So here we see something like prefix and pointer, and these are initialized to line 1 and 0. And then it looks like we're storing something and asserting a couple things. But I actually want to start by going to this store method because this is the method that we're storing. And it says store shell input statement into history list. It looks like, I guess we are like stripping the source, removing the white space at the beginning and the end. And I actually even want to look into the history object here because typically, as you could see here, there's some comments that I think are useful to our comprehension. So here we could see store is storing the source statement. And it is called from when we have to reset the output from the PyShell file. And then here, just to understand what prefix and pointer means, prefix is the source that is already entered at the prompt. So it looks like the actual text that we have typed out where the Python prompt should be. That's what prefix means, just like whatever is already entered there. And then pointer is an index into history. So I guess it's probably like an integer that represents, where we are in the chain of historical inputs. Like a 0 would indicate that we are at maybe the first in that list of historical inputs, in that list being, this list that we see here for self.history.history. So let's dive into this. It looks like we are setting the prefix to be line 1. So that means we are assuming line 1 is already entered in the Python prompt. And then the pointer is 0. So I'm assuming that means that we are at the 0th index in the list of historical inputs. And then when we store line 2, we should be having history.prefix and history.pointer equaling none. Okay, this is a bit confusing off the jump. Like, why should prefix and pointer be none when we store line 2? But here is where I would actually recommend going back and looking at store. So we could see here, we are storing a shell input. We, check if the source is longer than 2. That goes back to storing a short versus long input. I guess we sort of like handle appending that source to history. And then it looks like we are setting the pointer and prefix to be none. And so to me, what this means in combination with the test case is that when we actually store a new line, even if we had something already in the prefix and had the pointer actually be something, once we store a new line, we want the prefix and pointer to then go back to being none because there's no longer any prefix. Remember, we stored a new line, and so now it should just be empty. And we aren't actually looking at the history, so we want the pointer to be none. We don't want it to be 0 because that would indicate that we are at the first index or 0th index in all of the historical inputs. So this is how I would sort of walk through each of these 3 test cases. I do think there is something to also be gained from this exercise in terms of reading the source code and reading some comments, because that can also be quite helpful in understanding what is going on in the source code. But hopefully this was a good way to show how you can actually read these test cases and see the specific like intended behavior of our source code. Just to recap here, test store short is testing that we're not actually storing the short inputs into history. The test store duplicate is confirming that we are handling duplicate inputs correctly. And test store reset is making sure that the correct things happen in the Python prompt whenever we actually store or enter a new line. Cool. Hope you gained something from this exercise, and thanks for listening.